in the book.
I'm hearing some musical selections in the background. That's nice. But it might be a good idea before we get started if folks could mute their microphones so that we're not distracted by any outside noise. Thank you.
Good. And Rick, I'm gonna make you co-host so you could start sharing your slide.
Yeah, Ibrahima, why don't you give the introduction and we'll get underway.
Yes. All right. Let me
That is so much.
make you co-host. Okay, you are a co-host now. You could start sharing. Are we ready? Okay, hold on a second, Rick. All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Henry George School. This is going to be session 2 of our course, Land Value Return and Recycling for Prosperity, Sustainability, and Equity, with Rick Rybeck from Just Economics, LLC. So if you are just joining the class, we already did one session and I have the recording with me. Some of you requested it and I believe I sent it to them. If you still wanna have it, even though you attended, please drop me a line, send me an email by just replying to the invite, and I will get it to you instantly. So without any delays, I'm gonna let Rick step in and start the conversation. But before I even do that, Rick, if you don't mind, I just remember, we will have Rick present his slides, and at the end of the slides, we will open it for Q&A. So one thing that we haven't done last week, and I wish we could have done, is if you ask a question, just briefly mention your name and your affiliation. That would be very helpful. Thank you. You are muted, Rick. Rick, it looks like you are muted. Could you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Ibrahima, for that introduction. And do people write questions into the chat box or the question box? I can't tell what's up here.
The chat box.
The chat box. Okay, so if people have questions, please write them into the chat box. If it's something urgent, Ibrahima will interrupt me during the talk and we'll deal with it in real time. If it's the type of question that will be dealt with during our Q&A session at the end, then Ibrahima will save those and he will ask you to ask your question at the end and he will unmute you at that time. So without further ado, welcome to the class number 2. For those of you who missed class number 1 last week, we'll do a little recap so that everybody can be up to speed. Let's see. I have to. Okay, so what we know is that transportation problems don't always have transportation solutions. So here we see what appears to be a very congested and crowded street. And people might come to a couple conclusions. First conclusion might be, well, this road is just too small. We should make it wider, and that would reduce congestion. But what history has shown is that where we've widened roads, sure, in the short term, there's a reduction in congestion, but over time, the road tends to fill up again. And so some people have said that widening roads to cure congestion is like trying to solve obesity by buying a bigger belt. So that doesn't always seem to work. The other conclusion people might reach is they say, well, the reason this road is so congested is there are just too many people in a small space at the same time. And the way to resolve this problem would be to spread development out so people weren't so close together. And indeed, during the early 1900s, many urban planners thought by spreading development out, we could reduce congestion. But as it turns out, it doesn't quite work that way. What you see here is a graph that shows the relationship between density and congestion. On the horizontal axis, we have low density at the left and high density on the right. And the vertical axis, we have high congestion at the top and low congestion at the bottom. And the red line represents, I think, what most people have in their head when they think about this relationship. Most people think that this is a linear relationship, and that as density increases, so does congestion. As it turns out, reality more resembles the black line rather than the red line. And what's interesting about the black line is it shows that the highest levels of congestion up here happen at sort of middle suburban density. And why is that? Well, part of the reason goes to this picture. Cars take up a lot of space. The cars that you see here are parked, so they're nose to nose, or nose to tail, if you will. When cars are moving, they need at least one car length for every 10 miles an hour of speed that they're traveling to provide safe stopping. So cars take up an enormous amount of space. And in suburban areas, because development is so spread out and because it's segregated, people have to take an auto trip for just about every single activity they do outside the home. And that takes up an enormous amount of space and creates congestion. Whereas in cities, even though they're higher density, because you can take transit or bike, you can have an opportunity to access the things you need or want to do without an automobile trip. I think somebody has an open microphone. If you could mute your microphone, that would be helpful. Ibrahima, can you mute the open mic? Thank you. So land use is a problem. And here is the picture we saw before with the cars removed. And now the street doesn't look quite so congested. And you can see how much space people are taking up in their cars. And again, as I mentioned, these cars are very close together because they're standing still. When traffic is moving, these people require even more space. Here are the same number of people configured as if they were on a city bus. Now the street doesn't look congested at all. And here's the same number of people arrayed as if they were pedestrian and cyclists. So land use matters, and also mode matters. In other words, a street might be much more congested if everybody traveling is in an automobile, and much less congested if people are walking or cycling or using transit. So this is just a way to remind us that sprawl is responsible for some of our traffic problems and some of our environmental problems. Sprawl is defined as low density, discontinuous, and segregated land use. Walking and cycling are typically inconvenient, if not impossible. Transit, which depends on many people going the same direction at the same time, is typically outside the home, has to use an automobile trip. Smart growth is a term that was coined during the 1980s or 90s as a reaction against urban sprawl. And the notion was that development should occur where infrastructure already exists. And a corollary to smart growth is infill development. In other words, new growth should occur between existing development where infrastructure already exists, rather than in the green fields and the cornfields where infrastructure is lacking. Now, planners convened conferences extolling the virtues of smart growth, and they noted that many development regulations made traditional walkable communities illegal. And here's just a case that sort of compares and contrasts two different counties in regard to sprawl. On the left, and I should mention this illustration is provided by Joe Minicozy, who's a consultant with Urban 3. And what Joe has done is he's mapped property value per acre for two apparently rural counties. On the left is Orange County, North Carolina, which includes Chapel Hill. And on the right is Gwinnett County, Georgia, which is outside of Atlanta. And both of these counties have the same land area. They're between 400 and 430 square miles. Orange County has much fewer people. There are about 6.5 times more people in Gwinnett County than in Orange County. But what you'll notice is that development in Orange County is much more compact. In fact, you can see that there are very identifiable peaks around various downtowns. This is Chapel Hill, this is Carborough, and this is the county seat, Hillsborough. But everywhere else, the value per acre is very low. Here in Gwinnett County, where there's much more total development value throughout the whole county, you still don't have these peaks like you do in Orange County. Why? Because in Gwinnett County, development is spread like peanut butter across the entire landscape. And not only is that bad for the environment, it's bad for our budgets too. And let me show you those consequences. So this slide we looked at last week, and it shows us the cost per household of infrastructure. In an urban area, and this data is from Halifax in Canada, for the city of Halifax, the cost per household of urban infrastructure is $1,416. But in the suburban area of that same metropolis, the cost per household is $3,462, about 2.5 times greater. And why is that? It's not because these streets are paved with gold or that they use higher quality materials in the water pipes. The only reason that the cost per household is bigger is that in the city you have many households for each length of road or pipe. And in the suburbs, you have much fewer households, which means that the cost per household is greater. Now, in 1997, Maryland's Governor, Paris Glendening, decided that he wanted to put Maryland on a chart, on a path for smart growth. And so he enacted many laws to encourage smart growth. Incentives were created to encourage growth in developed areas already served by infrastructure and to reduce the conversion of farms, forest, and conservation lands into urban uses. Garrett Knapp, one of the architects of Maryland's smart growth laws, oversaw an evaluation of the program in 2011, so roughly 14 years after the program was started. And unfortunately, this study found that Maryland did not make substantial progress toward improving performance in most metrics related to smart growth. In other words, the amount of farmland being converted every year for development was about the same before and after the program was begun. And so, in spite of best efforts, very little, if any, progress was seen. And why was this? Well, certainly, real estate development takes a long time. So you don't expect to see these changes overnight. But after 14 or 15 years, you would expect to see something. I think the reason that Maryland didn't see as much progress as it hoped is because they failed to deal with the infrastructure conundrum. And this is what we talked about last week. So communities create infrastructure to facilitate development. And if that infrastructure is well designed and well executed, it increases the price of well-served land. And the higher prices of land then push development to cheaper but more remote sites. Communities then run after that new development with more infrastructure, but never catch up, because as soon as they extend infrastructure to this new community out in the cornfield, the cycle starts over again, land prices go up, choking off development, and development moves even further away. So the sprawl that we end up with is bad for the environment. It destroys lots of farmland and forest land. It creates auto dependency and traffic congestion, along with all the greenhouse gases and pollution and waste of energy that entails. And it strains our budgets due to the duplication of expensive infrastructure in low density areas, as the previous slide showed. Now, related to the infrastructure conundrum is the problem of no good deed goes unpunished. We can see perhaps a distressed community, and we'll think to ourselves, how can we make life better for people in this situation? And we might think to ourselves, well, better schools, better public safety, or perhaps better transportation so that they'd have better access to jobs and education. Any of these things might be helpful. And if we accomplish any of these things, land prices are likely to rise, as are rents, and many of the intended beneficiaries might be displaced as a result. The tax dollars that we spend to help the poor end up enriching landowners instead. Of course, landowners tend not to be very poor to begin with. So, what's the common thread between the infrastructure conundrum and no good deed goes unpunished? The common thread is land speculation. And what is that? Land speculation is simply the buying and selling of land, not for the sake of using it, but for the sake of holding it, hoping that it will go up in price in the future. So when people buy and sell land from each other, that in itself creates nothing of value. But land speculation does create the following. It creates an artificial scarcity of developable land, particularly in prime locations. And by prime locations, I mean areas next to urban infrastructure like streets and transit and good schools and parks. This artificial scarcity of development in these locations, because people are holding that land for future appreciation, that artificial scarcity of land results in real increases in land prices. And those increase in land prices then kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As people see land prices go up, they say, well, gee, I'd be silly to sell my land to development. I should sit and wait. So it encourages more people to hold land out of use. And that, as we see in the infrastructure conundrum, helps create sprawl by pushing development to cheaper but more remote sites. And this process of speculating in land by driving users to the far edges of the metropolitan area result in at the core, eventually you just have land speculators buying and selling from each other. And eventually people realize that these land prices have no relationship to what land is worth. And the bottom falls out, the bubble bursts, and not only does that create a bust in the real estate market, but it can bring the economy crashing down along with it. So it's the ability of private landowners to appropriate publicly created land value. That's the fuel for land speculation. And we showed a graph last week that talked about how this works. So here you can see this upside down triangle represents the public, tenants and landowners. And as I mentioned last week, tenants include not only residential tenants, but the vast majority of businesses don't own the place they have their business. Most businesses are tenants. So the public is paying taxes on labor and capital to the government. The government is using those taxes to create public goods and services, which in turn create land value. Only a small portion of that land value trickles back to the public sector through the property tax. The lion's share of land value ends up as a windfall, primarily to the owner of prime sites. And what's kind of pernicious about this is that we've created a redistribution of wealth. not the way we usually think of it, but in a way that my father would refer to it as welfare, or welfare for the wealthy. In other words, we're taxing everybody to create wealth that primarily accrues to the owners of prime sites, who are already the most powerful and wealthy individual and businesses in our society. And what's sort of perverse about this is that once people pay taxes to create public goods and services, if they really want to take advantage of those public goods and services, they want to have their house or their office or their store next to the highway interchange or the transit stop or the goods school or the park. And when they go to the landlord to put their house or business there, the landlord says, well, you've got to pay a high rent to locate at this prime location. So people end up paying twice for infrastructure, which is not a very palatable situation for most people. And what we proposed last week as a solution is this, which is land value return and recycling. And what's unique about this picture, which is essentially the same, is that now we're returning a much more robust share of publicly created land value to the public sector that created it in the first place. And as you can see, public infrastructure now becomes financially self-sustaining, if not completely, at least to a much greater degree than it did before. And what's good about this is that because the infrastructure is sustaining itself financially, there's much a reduction of taxes being paid to the government. And I'll just show you the prior slide so you can focus in on that change. And by reducing the taxes on labor and capital, we can make the economy of this community much more robust, which is a good thing. And the other thing that happens is interesting is right here, which is as we return more land value to the public sector, land prices don't go up as much, which means that people who want to have access to the public goods and services they paid for can do so with a lower rent. And again, I'll toggle back to the prior slide so you can see the difference. So land value return and recycling is simply that when infrastructure is well designed and well executed, it inflates the price of nearby land. And returning that publicly created land value to the public sector that created it and recycling that revenue for infrastructure creation, operation, and maintenance is what we refer to as land value return and recycling. And I may refer to it as LVRR, or land value return. So that's a recap of last week. And now let's get into the meat of tonight's class, which is, how does land value return actually overcome the infrastructure conundrum, which under the present situation sort of chases development into the cornfields, if you will. And I think the easiest way to understand this is to compare two different ways of funding infrastructure. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at a development fee, or DF, and contrast that with land value return and recycling. And so here, just for the sake of this example, we have a public facility. This could be a transit station, and two adjacent lots. This lot is vacant, and this lot is developed, has a nice building on it. Could be commercial or residential or both. And what some people might say is, well, this property owner is getting a lot of revenue from people who are using his site or her site. And the people who are using the site are most likely using this transit service. So certainly it would seem to be fair that the more intensely developed this property is, the more it should pay for the infrastructure. And so we'll put a fee on property based on how intensely the development is. So that's the basis for the fee, is the intensity of development. Land value return and recycling takes a very different approach. Under land value return, we say this public facility is creating equal opportunity on both pieces of land, regardless of whether it's developed or not. And each landowner, because the land is going up in value as a result, gets the same benefit. And therefore, the landowner should pay based on the value they receive from the public facilities. So let's see how these different approaches work out in practice. So the development fee, as we mentioned before, is a fee imposed on building values to offset infrastructure costs. But as we saw looking at the vacant lot, if there's no building, obviously there's no fee to be paid. Therefore, the development fee is a cost of production. In Economics 101, we learned that if you increase the cost of production, less stuff gets produced. And if there's less stuff being produced and demand stays the same, then the price of what's left over goes up. So the question is, next to valuable public infrastructure, like a road network or a transit station or a good school, do we want to reduce development near that infrastructure and increase its price? I don't think so. But that's the impact of a development fee. And the thing to remember here is that a fee on building value appropriates privately created value. In other words, that building doesn't have value unless the owner and the owner's partners, say banks or other investors, actually invest in creating and maintaining that building. And by putting a fee on that, we create a burden on both builders, future occupants, and consumers. Because as we see, that fee results in higher prices that get passed on to the future building users. Now, land value return and recycling is a different approach. Instead of a fee based on the value of the building, this fee is based on the value of land. And the thing that makes land interesting is that unlike a building, land is not produced. So the supply of land will not shrink as a result of imposing a fee. So land value return is not a cost of production because land isn't produced. So what is land value return? It's a cost of ownership. And this is very important because this determines the impact of land value return on the price of land. Land is not produced, so where does the price of land come from? The price of land is based on the benefits that people expect to receive from owning a piece of land. So if I increase the cost of land ownership by imposing land value return, I'm reducing the benefits of ownership. And if I reduce the benefits of ownership, then people are going to pay less for that land after I impose the fee than they did before. So this might be the single hardest thing to wrap our heads around during tonight's class. We take it for granted that if you put a tax or fee on something, the price goes up. And the reason for that is that almost everything we're familiar with, the clothes I'm wearing, the laptop I'm using, the desk that my laptop sits on, all of these things are things that are produced. And if I put a tax or fee on any of these things, it's a cost of production. And as in the slide we showed before, that cost of production means less stuff gets produced and the price goes up. So we take it for granted that if we tax or put a fee on something, the price will go up. But land, because it is not produced, because the supply of land is fixed, the price of land goes down when you tax it or put a fee on it. So that is very unusual and sometimes a little difficult to comprehend. But this is what makes land value return and recycling such a powerful tool, because it does not put any burden on builders or future occupants or consumers. And I'll show you how this works. Here is the same picture we saw before. Here's our transit stop, the two properties. And let's say the community wants $1,000 in revenue to help run the transit station. Well, if we're using a development fee, this developed lot is going to have to pay the whole freight because there's nothing here to put a fee on. So this lot pays nothing, and this owner pays $1,000. But if we use land value return and recycling, each landowner will pay $500. And not only might that be more fair because they're both receiving the same benefit in terms of higher land value, but it has interesting incentive effects. This owner is not punished for having a building, and if they want to improve or maintain this building, there's no additional fee to make that more costly. On the other hand, this owner of the vacant lot, who pays nothing under the development fee and is therefore encouraged to sit and wait because it costs them nothing to do so. But under a land value return, all of a sudden they're paying $500 a year on land that's generating no income. Well, that will motivate this owner to develop the land. Why? In order to generate some income from which to pay the fee. And if they put up development here, that doesn't increase their fee because the fee is based on land value. So we're not punishing this owner for development, and that is very, very important. So again, let's look at how landowners respond to these different approaches for funding infrastructure. The development fee can be avoided by the landowner in several ways. First, if I own a piece of land, I could decide, well, I don't want to pay that fee, so I'm going to leave my land vacant. So I'll reduce either the number, the size, or the quality of the new buildings I create. And if I really want to build a new building, maybe I'll build it in a lower tax jurisdiction somewhere else. And if I have an existing building, I'll reduce the maintenance on it. That'll make the value go down and make my fee go down. How do landowners respond to land value return? Well, the thing that's interesting is that unlike the development fee, which is based on the value of development, which is controlled by the owner, land value return cannot be avoided because the value of land is not controlled by the owner. The value of land is created by what the community does around it to make it a valuable place to live or have a business. So the location value of a piece of land is not determined by the owner. And whereas up here, the owner of a piece of land could avoid the development fee by building in a lower tax jurisdiction, it's very hard to have that same response regarding the land value fee. I can't actually see a show of hands, but perhaps in the chat box, you could let me know, has anybody in the audience ever tried to move a piece of land from a high tax jurisdiction to a low tax jurisdiction? It's a very difficult thing to do. The logistics are awful. There are so many dump trucks involved. And after days or weeks of moving these dump trucks, at the end of the day, you still have a piece of land in a high tax jurisdiction. So in other words, owners can't move a piece of land from a high tax to a low tax jurisdiction. So because I can't avoid the tax on land value, I have only one option, which is to develop that land to generate income from which to pay the tax or fee, or sell to somebody who will do so. So, under land value return and recycling, landowners pay for infrastructure benefits in proportion to benefits received. The highest payments are due from high-value sites, and high-value sites are the sites we find near urban infrastructure amenities. And as we've just discovered, land value return encourages the development of high-value land. So instead of the status quo, where high land prices push development away, land value return does the opposite. It pulls development to high-value land and draws development in toward existing infrastructure like transportation, good schools, parks, and other amenities. Thus, over time, land value return and recycling reduces sprawl. And by reducing sprawl, by making development more compact, we can reduce infrastructure duplication. And this lowers the per capita costs of infrastructure and tax burdens. So now, having covered that, I'd like to open it for questions.
Hey, Rick, this is Marty Rowland.
Hi, Marty.
Yeah, so I really like the slides today. So I was thinking about the technique that a lot of cities use called tax increment financing. And I think the politicians think that they've got something snazzy, but what they're really doing is taking an income stream that might go to pay for infrastructure and divert it to paying for the capital investment of some private entity. So if you didn't have the tax increment financing, you'd probably have more money going to infrastructure in the first place. So it's kind of like a short circuiting of a system, but since the general belief is that, well, tax money is just stuff that we can throw around without anybody being harmed, because we all know that taxing is evil or something. Do you want to comment on that?
I do, but you've actually sort of anticipated what we're going to talk about in next week's class. So
Okay, sorry.
no problem, no problem. It shows you're thinking in a logical way, because that's the next thing that we're going to cover. And what some people in our audience may have heard of something called value capture. It's a fairly arcane term, but some people may have heard about it. And I don't use it for the very reason that you just suggested. A lot of people say tax increment financing is value capture. In other words, returning publicly created value to the public sector. And as it turns out, tax increment financing is kind of a sleight of hand, as you suggested. And we'll go into detail about this next week when I compare and contrast land value return to other techniques that are often referred to as value capture. So thank you for asking it, and I hope the audience will forgive me for postponing the detailed answer until next week.
It looks like Yanis has a question, and please everyone, don't forget to mention your affiliation before you ask your question.
Yes, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Yanis, go ahead.
Yes, I'm Yanis Zeligakis, an MEVP for the International Union. Now, I have two questions. One on the slide that you presented, one with the building, the metro line, and then the vacant building. Rick,
Yes.
Yes. Okay, on that building, it seems to me that the building owner is has much larger rental income, and it looks like you don't want to you want to put the same burden on him who's collecting insurmountably higher rental incomes on his tenants than the adjacent guy that for XYZ reason, because he doesn't have the capital, cannot develop that piece of land. So your scheme, what's going to happen is that guy is going to be forced to sell to the big rent collector, which is the building on the other side of the subway. That's yeah, okay. So that's my first comment.
So here's how I would respond, and I think we'll get into this more in some of our later sessions, but you're raising a good point, which is the people who are occupying this building, they are using this infrastructure. And shouldn't we charge those people based on their use of the infrastructure? And my answer to that is yes. So in all likelihood, the transit system And I don't know, can people see my cursor or not? Ibrahima, can people see my cursor?
Yes,
Yes.
it's visible.
Yes,
Not the red
Right,
little
okay.
dot, but we do see the mouse.
Okay, so the people who are using this transit station are paying a fare to use the transit system. So these people are paying what we call a user fee. And that's a good thing. The people, now I've lost, don't know what, there's my cursor. The people in this building are also consuming water. And so they're paying a user fee. The building owner is charged per gallon of water every time somebody drinks out of the fountain or flushes a toilet. So they are paying user fees to use that infrastructure. User fees are important and a good thing, and I support that.
Right, but Rick, that's not what I'm referring to. If the building owner is not charging rent, in other words, he's only charging his tenants his building costs and his city costs and his utility costs, then there is no rent. And then, of course, it makes sense to charge both landowners with the same cost. But the reality is that the building owner is over collecting rents from his hardworking tenants. And,
Well, here's
and that leads me to my corollary. My second point would be that imagine I am one of those tenants, okay, that I'm paying a high rent. Okay, so my building owner is collecting from me value that I create through my labor. So I do not see how he's collecting that rent from me is publicly owned. I create that. If you're going to redistribute that, you better return that to me, not to every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the city.
well, I think
That's my second point. So
yes, you make a good point, and let me just say that the rent that's being charged on this building, this rent that the tenants are paying, consists of two things. First of all, the owner of the building is actually providing a service. He's providing a space to these people, either to live or work. And even if the tenants owned the building themselves, they themselves would have to pay rent to themselves to build the building, to maintain it and operate it. So to some extent, the rent that's being paid is paying for a service that's being provided. And there's nothing wrong with that. So that part of the rent is justified. But
you really think, hold on, because in New York City, let's say an average rent is, let's say $3,000, let's say for a studio apartment in Murray Hill, close to the Henry George School. Do you really believe that the landlord is doing, and these are buildings which are like 20 and 30 years old, so their development cost has already been paid, okay? Do you really believe that every month the landlord is putting $3,000 worth of maintenance?
No, absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. And that's why I said, if you'll let me finish, that the building rent consists of two things. It consists of what you compensate the landowner for creating and maintaining the building, but it also covers the cost of the land. And the value of the land, as we mentioned before, is not created by the owner, that's created by the community. And especially in Manhattan, and especially next to transit, that community created value is going to be very high.
I'm paying that, Rick, I'm paying for that value, not the community. I'm paying
that's
that value. It's not community created. I create that value. I pay it from my wages. That's my point of contention.
This is my point right here, is that people right now are paying a high rent premium to access the land that's made very valuable by their taxes. So people are paying twice for infrastructure. But with land value return and recycling, because we're returning that land to the public sector, there's less of a windfall to the landowner, which means that the part of the rent that goes for land gets diminished. You can see it shrinks from one slide to the other. And that's the part as I said, that's the hardest part of this thing to understand, that by increasing the return of land value to the public sector, it brings the price of land down. And therefore, it will diminish. Let's go back to this slide. The more we charge rent, the more we charge land value return, the lower the rent will be for the land portion of this rent. And these people are already benefiting because they're sharing the rent on this land, whereas here there's nobody. And one of the things that's very important to understand, I mentioned this last week, but we'll go through it again tonight, is that in order to pay for infrastructure, you need to have a good balance between what I call user fees and access fees. So let's think about a user fee that we're all familiar with, like paying for water by the gallon. So all the people in this building, they're all paying per gallon every time they take a drink from the sink or anytime they flush a toilet. And the more they drink, the more they flush, the more they pay. We might think that's fair. The other thing that happens too is that if they have a leaky faucet, they don't just see water going down the drain, they see their money going down the drain. So this user fee motivates them to conserve water and to fix leaky faucets. If we tried to pay for water and sewer with a sales taxes raise lots of money. But if the person in this apartment had a leaky faucet, would they be motivated to fix it if they paid through a sales tax? And if they were paying for it through a sales tax, would they go out and buy something they didn't want just to compensate the water authority with extra sales tax? Probably not. So the user fee has a very good incentive effect. But now let's think about the owner here. Let's say instead of transit, let's say this is a water main. The owner here is not drinking any water or flushing any toilets. Should they pay anything to the owner of the water authority? Now, some people would say, well, they're not drinking any water or flushing any toilets. The answer is no. I would suggest that they're mistaken. And the way I would do this is by contrasting the value of this land with the piece of land, say, over here. Let's say the piece of land over here is a mile away from any water or sewer pipe. Which piece of land is more valuable? Obviously, this land. Is it because of anything the owner did? No. It's because the Water and Sewer Authority has built and hopefully maintains this water main and the sewer main. So the increase in value that is here compared to here, that belongs to the Water and Sewer Authority. And under this approach, the owner of this lot would pay the Water and Sewer Authority, and that would be an infrastructure access fee. In other words, just having access to infrastructure creates value. And right now, we give away that value to the landowners. With land value return and recycling, the public gets a fair return on the value it creates. I happen to be a member of a housing cooperative. We own our building as a co-op. And I know it costs a lot of money to maintain this building. We pay high co-op fees every month instead of rent. And who are we paying that to? Well, we're paying it to ourselves. But the cost to maintain and operate this building is substantial. I can tell you that as the vice president of our co-op. Ibrahima, who's our next?
Yes, Ed Dodson. Ed, are you still here?
Yeah, Rick, Ed Dodson here. For those of you who wanted an introduction, I'm retired from the financial services industry. I managed the residential mortgage program for a commercial bank for a number of years, and then spent my last 20 years at Fannie Mae as a business manager and market analyst working on affordable housing initiatives. My question to you first, Rick, is whether or not the data that you've seen makes any distinction between whether or not owners reside in the community or are absentee owners to the extent that they bring their sites to the highest best use?
That's an interesting question. And the very brief answer is that I haven't seen any data to indicate that land use depends on whether owners are live in the community or whether they're absentee. Certainly, one of the things that strikes me as interesting, and I'm sure people in the audience will notice this, from time to time, there's a big concern about foreign people buying property in your city or in some city. Whether a landlord is domestic or foreign, I think makes little difference. Money is green and the incentives are the same, regardless of whether the owner is located here or at some foreign country. I do think that incentives are important. And one of the things that we've noted under the status quo, which is here, is that by providing this unearned windfall to landowners, we encourage people to sit and wait. And that encouragement is the same whether somebody lives in the community or outside. If I own a piece of land in the downtown next to a metro station, and I think that the values are going to go up in the future, I might decide, well, I'd be silly to sell it for development today. I'll just sit and wait. And that's just as true whether I'm living in suburban Washington or suburban New York City or in Stuttgart. The incentive effect is the same.
I have, and I was listening to what Giannis was asking you, and I apologize if I didn't pick this up in your response to him. But it seems to me that the key, market response to a land value recapture and recycle fee or charge would be to change the relationship between supply and demand, and that the owner of the vacant land, by bringing his land to its highest best use, would in effect create competition by improvement property owners for tenants or for businesses, so that their costs, that what they could charge as a leasing fee would certainly come down because of the higher supply of competitive space that would be available. And the same thing would apply to residential units as well.
I think that's a very important point, Ed. Thank you for making that point, which is one of the reasons that the rent for this building is as high as it is because of the limited supply of buildings. And as we said, if we use a development fee, we discourage building and make the price of what's left over higher. If you think about it, this development fee is very much like the property tax that we apply to buildings today. If we did land value return instead, that would encourage the owner of this property to put a building on it also. And if we now have more built space, as you said so correctly, that creates a greater supply of built space, and the greater supply of built space means that rents will come down. Now, this won't happen right away, but it will happen over time. So thank you for pointing that out, Ed, which is the more we make better use of land around infrastructure, the lower rents will be.
I have one final observation, then I'll pass the baton. And that is when you said, jokingly, you'd like to hear from somebody who's dug up their land and taken it out of the community. There are cases where entire communities have managed legally to separate from a city in order to remove them from the city's tax base and to start their own community. And then on the opposite side, there are many cities that have managed to annex surrounding contiguous areas, bringing that rural land into their taxing jurisdiction.
Right.
At the same time, giving the rural area access to water and sewer and other public services that they otherwise wouldn't have access to.
That's a good point. We'll talk about annexation or secession perhaps in another discussion. But that's a good point.
Great. It looks like Alex has a question.
Great, thanks for taking my question. So I live in Annapolis, and one of the situations that we have downtown Annapolis in our historic district is that there are probably a handful of people that own a fair amount of the land. And
Right.
it's not a question of should it be developed or redeveloped, because this is a historic district. So the buildings that are there are what's there, and that's what people want to stay there. The question is, because they've owned it for a long time, they have little carrying costs. So there's not a lot of incentive to lower rents to increase occupancy. So we do have a lot of vacancies. And I'm just curious how LVRR would play into, you know, a higher and best use in terms of occupancy, not so much the buildings themselves or the form.
Well, I think the point here is that if this building is vacant, then in a way, it's very much like the vacant lot. The assessor will say, oh, this building is vacant, it's not worth very much. And therefore, under the status quo, the tax on this property is very low, and the owner has little motivation to do anything. But under land value return and recycling, you know, if the tax is based on the value of the land, then the land tax will go up, and that will encourage this person to develop, and will also encourage this person to put that building into use so they can get the income from the building to pay the tax. So land value return and recycling encourages utilization of property, particularly where the property is valuable. And certainly in the Annapolis Historic District, property is very, very valuable. And that's mostly because of the value of the land.
Right. Well, so our tax structure, and we follow Anne Arundel County's tax structure. So it's broken up. I don't know what the exact percentages are between land value and improved. So in this historic district, the improved value is, I mean, they're both very high. Yet
Right.
I just don't understand what the incentive is for a landowner to keep something vacant. It's just puzzling, and nobody seems to really understand what the incentive is that causes that.
Yeah, I would have to know more about the specific situation in Annapolis to know that, but it's true that basically because we have an upside down tax system and we punish people for building, improving, and maintaining buildings, and we reward people for allowing buildings to deteriorate, or again, the person who owns a vacant lot will pay, or a boarded up building pays less than their more responsible neighbor, even though it costs the very same to maintain the street and sidewalk in front of both properties. Yeah, this upside down tax system creates perverse incentives that are very hard to understand. The nice thing about land value return is it sort of complements user fees. We were talking about how the user fee for water encourages conservation and the fixing of leaks. The access fee works in a very similar way. If you have a valuable piece of land and you're paying nothing to own it and keep it vacant, you're not that motivated to develop it. But if you're paying a high fee based on the high value, then you have a motivation to get higher income, which means you want to develop and maintain your property. And the more you develop and maintain your property in a high value location, then there's a greater supply of developed space, and that's good for people who are space users, whether they be businesses or residential tenants. They now have more supply, and as a result, lower rents. Ibrahimo, who's our next
Yes,
person with a question or comment?
Josh. Josh, are you here? Let me see if I can unmute him from here. Josh.
Hi, I didn't have a question. I was just responding to another person in the chat. Sorry.
Okay, I see. How about Ellen? Looks like Ellen doesn't have a question. Gabrielle.
No, sir. I was also kind of responding to the comment on, I mean, again, Gabriel Nagy.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes,
Tell
sorry,
people-
Rick, I was going to do that. I'm a developer and urban planner working in the city of Chicago. I'm working in Latin America and the Caribbean. And just the comment that I have been following the land value capture, or sorry, the single land tax for a while. And I think that the current status quo, as you have been mentioned, Rick, is just is preventing development, and especially on affordable housing or housing that is affordable. I'm currently trying to develop a piece of land in the south side of Chicago, and the landowner is just sitting down there, very low taxes, is just waiting and asking for at least 13,000 square feet. He's asking about $1 million. And I was just going to make a comment. If that is usually the tax price of land in jurisdictions like in France is an automatic offer of to be purchased by the government. So when you say that it's too expensive, you have to pay taxes for that amount. But it's the government who says this is the price of land, and if I need to buy that land to develop housing or about that is the price that I'm going to pay you for compensation. But it's basically, in my understanding, it's very much based on the tax land. I'm just very curious. I was, Ibrahim touched on me, but I was not really making any question, but just following with a lot of interest this conversation and how much we need to change this issue, because we need more housing, we need more development.
Right, you make a good point, and what I'm going to try to do is show people through a different approach how the tax on buildings is pernicious. So this is your typical supply and demand curve. I've shied away from this so far, but perhaps some people would find this useful. So the demand curve, this shows the quantity of something that's produced, and this shows the price. Price gets higher in this direction, quantity gets higher in this direction. So if the price of something is very high, people demand very little of it. If the price is low, people want a lot. And so that's the shape of the demand curve. The lower the price, the more people want. With supply, the curve has an opposite shape. At a low price, nobody wants to build or produce whatever is being demanded. But at a high price, people will produce more. So this is the supply curve, this is the demand curve, and where these two curves meet is what we call in economics equilibrium. And that's where if we build this quantity of stuff, this is the price that will be charged. Now the problem is when we put a tax on the value of buildings, like that development fee or like the property tax that falls on buildings, we create a situation that looks like this. So here was our, I'm sorry these graphs aren't exactly the same, but here was our initial supply curve. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. But basically by putting a tax on the value of the building, we've increased the cost of supply. So we've shifted the supply curve up to the left. And what that shows is the quantity of stuff shrinks from quantity 1 to quantity 2. So we've reduced the quantity supplied, but now at this lower quantity, we're higher up on the demand curve, so the price has gone up. That's why the tax or fee applied to building values is counterproductive. It shrinks the amount of supply of housing at a time we need it, and it raises the price. So that's the problem. And here's what's unusual about the tax of the land. Here's your demand curve for land. It's shifts from the upper left to lower right. But what's unusual is the supply curve isn't a curve at all. It's vertical, it's straight up and down. So if there is no tax, this is the quantity of land. And if you impose a tax, the quantity of land doesn't change. So the price of land that people pay is right here. If you impose a tax, then this amount of money goes to the government, and this goes to the owners of land. If you have no tax, all the area under the price goes to the landowners. So at one level, you're saying, well, if you put a tax on land, it simply shifts who gets revenue from the land, but it doesn't really bring the price of land down. Actually, what happens, because people are holding land out of use in this situation, to the extent that people now bring this land into use and start putting a building on it, we've actually increased the supply of land, and that brings the price of land down in real terms. So increasing the tax or fee on land value can produce lower land prices. And therefore, what's interesting is that shifting the tax off of buildings makes buildings more affordable. Shifting that tax onto land makes land prices more affordable also. So, without spending any additional money or losing any revenue, simply by shifting the tax off of the building and adding it onto land, communities can make both buildings and land more affordable to residents and businesses alike, which would make their community much more prosperous and equitable. Ibrahima, who has our next question?
The next question is, should be from Jose. Jose,
Yes, I wanted to ask if the development fee you mentioned is not the same that onerous concession of the right to build used, for example, in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And
you know, there are different types of development fees, and in some places, for example, in this country, we have something called a development impact fee. And this is typically imposed in rural jurisdictions that are lacking infrastructure. And if it's determined that a new development will require the building of new infrastructure, they don't want to have everybody subsidize that new development. So instead of causing everybody to pay for the new infrastructure that's required by the new development, we charge a development impact fee. That's a one-time fee. It's supposed to offset the cost of new infrastructure. It's paid for by the developer in exchange for a development permit, and then they pass that along to the people who will buy or rent that development. Is that the type of fee you're talking about in Sao Paulo?
I think it's different. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the fee in Sao Paulo. I'd have to learn about that in order to respond to your question.
Okay.
Good, so we have Sami. Let me unmute you. Go ahead, Sami. He's having issues muting. Looks like he's have issues unmuting himself. So why don't we go to Ed, and then we'll come back to Sami.
Yeah, Rick, I was just thinking, I wanted not to monopolize the discussion, but the young man who asked about Annapolis, it just reminded me of some of the issues that I faced in infill development in historic districts, and the issue of restrictive covenants in a lot of historic buildings. The question is, well, what can the owner actually do with the building? Do they have to retain the facade? What other restrictions are placed, for example, on construction materials? And all of that has a lot to do with whether or not the building can really be brought into a modern use to generate the revenue. But the market response to this should be that the rental value of that location would be lower than if there were no restrictive covenants.
That's right. So we talk about development regulations and zoning. And so let me just go up to this illustration just to show you're exactly right. Here we have a 3-story building. But let's say this site is also zoned for a 3-story building. It has a certain value based on the potential income that it could get for a 3-story building at this location with nearby infrastructure. If we were to change the zoning so that instead of a 3-story building, we allow a 6-story building on the same footprint, basically the land value would double roughly. Again, not because of the owner did anything, but simply because the public sector, by changing the development permission, created value that the landowner can appropriate. Likewise, if we zone, let's say this 3-story building, let's say we rezone this land for 6 stories, but we also say this building is historic and that we don't allow the owner to make any changes whatsoever to this building. Well, the value of the land will not represent the value of a 6-story building because of these historic restrictions. The value of the land will be reduced to reflect what a historic 3-story building can provide. So you're right. The value of the land is based on what the owner can do with it. And what the owner can do with it is based on what the population and economic demand is, what the infrastructure facilitates, and what development regulations permit. So you've got all these sort of intersecting lines, if you will, and the value of land is determined where these lines intersect. Good point, Ed. Ibrahima, are there other questions,
Yes,
or did you want to read from the chat box if people can't unmute?
Sure, yes, there is a question. Looks like there is a question from Michael. Michael, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a great example that every question that's fielded to Rick, he's able to respond in a way where this LVRR policy returns good results. You know, so you would think, that being the case, that municipalities and the counties and the federal government would decide to, you know, this would be like a slam dunk. But on the contrary, they avoid it like the pox.
Right. Well, now you've anticipated our last class. So class number 5, we're going to talk about opportunities and challenges for implementation. And, you know, just to give a little preview, a lot of people will say, well, if land value return and recycling is such a great idea, how come it's not done in very many places? And there are a couple responses. The first response is that it's done almost everywhere, because almost every place has a traditional property tax. And part of that property tax is a tax on the value of land. So almost every place practices land value return and recycling. However, as we showed in the slide, if I can bring that back up, let me go to that slide. So every jurisdiction that has a traditional property tax is at least doing this much land value return and recycling. Now, property tax rates vary from place to place, but the national average for property tax is between 1% and 2% of value. So basically, for every $100 of land value that's created, approximately $10 to $20 is returned in net present value to the public sector. What that means is that 80 to 90% of that publicly created land value is given away. So the first answer is it's not rare, it's done everywhere. But then the next question is, well, why isn't it done more robustly? And certainly the people who benefit from the current situation, the people who are the owners of prime sites, they're very affluent and powerful people. And I don't know if we have the capacity to take a poll, but it would be interesting to know how many people taking this course have thought about the difference in terms of land and building values. Most people have never considered this distinction. They think of the property tax as a single tax. In other words, a tax on the value of property. They don't realize that the tax on buildings and the tax on land act very differently from one another and have very different impacts and incentives. So I think part of the reason why this isn't more widespread is simply because people don't know about it. And certainly there are entrenched interests that want to keep it that way. But we'll get more into this into class 5. So thank you for giving us a little preview of that. Ibrahima, who's next on our list?
Tami is still not back, so, but it looks like Marty does have a question. Marty, are you still here? Marty?
Yeah, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I guess I didn't introduce myself before. Yeah, my name's Marty Rowland. I'm on the board of Henry George School. I'm an instructor, and I also developed a standard with ASTM on infrastructure management. And so I had, maybe following up on Michael. So what I see was that that everywhere has a property tax. So it's kind of like we've got a 6-cylinder engine running on 2, and the question is, why don't we let the other 4 cylinders run? And I think you just described why. One of the things that comes up, and because this is the Henry George School teaching this, is that we sometimes forget that Henry George said that in order to benefit society and reach human progress, we need to have to do away with the private ownership of land. And so he was talking about relaxing all the other taxes, so you can see where things are made up because of the loss of land value through income tax, sales tax, all these other things. And that's kind of like explaining the reason that things don't change, that everybody has been convinced that, well, I'd have to play my...
Marty, you have a connection problem, I believe.
Well, we're having a trouble hearing Marty, and if you permit me,
yes,
I'll just jump in.
Marty.
It's a good point made about other taxes and fees, that since World War II, at both the national level and the state and local level, we've reduced our reliance on user fees and increased our reliance on general taxes like the income tax and the sales tax. And this has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that people don't like user fees. In other words, when I go to park and I have to pay the parking meter, I find that annoying. When the guy reads my water meter and I have to pay based on the number of gallons I've paid, I find that annoying. The thing that politicians and some people like about the sales tax is that you can increase the sales tax by a small fraction and raise a lot of money. And it seems almost invisible. I mean, people hardly notice it. So that makes it very popular. But the problem about paying for water with a sales tax, as I mentioned before, is that it divorces us as consumers from our behavior. When we're paying by the gallon, we're focused on conserving water and repairing leaks. If we pay for water with a sales tax, we leave the faucet running, we waste water, we don't repair leaks, and that has very bad consequences for our infrastructure and for the environment. So user fees have a good incentive effect. Access fees, fees based on the value of land, have the same effect. Right now, because they're so low, we encourage people who have valuable land next to valuable infrastructure to sit and wait. And this deprives the community of the value that they've created in that infrastructure and in that well-served land. And if we were to put in more robust access fees, they would act like user fees and motivate more appropriate use of land based on the potential productivity that the community has created in that land. So these general taxes have created these large slush funds, and it's by divorcing us from our consumption of public goods and services, it creates a number of problems. One problem is that people feel like they're paying a lot of taxes and they don't know how their taxes are being spent. They think it just goes off into the ether and disappears. So at that level, it helps foment tax revolts, and we've seen plenty of that lately. The other thing is that because we're not aware of the cost of the infrastructure we consume, we get in our car and we drive someplace. And because we don't pay anything while we're doing it, it seems like the pavement and the pavement markings and the traffic signals and the street lights, it's as if they were free. And because it's as if they were free, we don't even notice it. So this is a problem of relying on these general taxes, both income and sales, to get us away from user fees and access fees. And when we get into next week's class, we'll talk more about real world examples, and especially in class 4. And you'll see how the balance between user fees and access fees is so important to making our infrastructure run well and making our communities more productive and more affordable. Ibrahima, who's next?
Looks like Derek has a question.
Hi, this is in Oakland Common Ground, California. My question is about the just the use of development fees as a kind of reigning model. Have you considered the fact that development fees are often kind of structured in terms of the use that they can be, what they can be used for in terms of public revenue, due to Supreme Court rulings, the Nolan-Dolan exaction standards, which says it has to have an essential nexus and rough proportionality to what you're developing, what we're going to charge you for, and what you're going to pay for. From my perspective, this LVRR gives the city more, or the government more flexibility in terms of managing those infrastructure resources, and also because it's an ongoing payment rather than a one-time payment. There's a tendency to focus on capital investment rather than operations investment. And I think that might be a downside. Another downside of the development fee model is that it focuses on capital investment and it doesn't treat paying people to run trains or take care of streets as nearly important.
Well, that's a very good point. Again, you're sort of leading into next week's class where we'll talk about the different value capture techniques, one of which is called a development impact fee. And I probably created some confusion by talking about a development fee. I didn't want to equate that with a development impact fee. And as I'll talk about next week, development impact fees can be appropriate. So for example, in a rural area that's lacking infrastructure, one of the things that we noted about the infrastructure conundrum was that high land values around existing infrastructure chase development into the cornfields. And the cornfields are cheap because there's no infrastructure there. So if somebody develops there and then the people who move into the cornfield say, hey, we need bigger streets and bigger water pipes and more transit, and everybody in that area helps pay for it, well, basically, there's a cross-subsidy going on. Everybody in the community is subsidizing that development in the cornfield. So a development impact fee, to the extent that it levels the playing field and says, well, if you're going to develop in an area that's lacking infrastructure, you're going to have to pay for the infrastructure development cost caused by your development. And that's where your reference to the Supreme Court cases comes in. You have to legally implement a development impact fee, you have to show the relationship between the new development and the new infrastructure in order to charge the fee and make it constitutional. And assuming that you could do that, I would say that development impact fees are appropriate in rural areas where you're lacking infrastructure and you want to level the playing field between the cornfield and the downtown and actually sort of push development back toward the downtown. So development impact fees can be useful in that way. And one of the things we'll talk about next week is, you mentioned these Supreme Court cases. The Supreme Court cases were to avoid what was called a taking. Now, the Fifth Amendment to our Constitution has a clause in it which says that the government can't take private property, except, this is a big except, the government can take private property if it's for a public purpose and if they pay proper compensation to the private property, to the private owner whose property is being taken. What's interesting is that taking is just one side of a two-sided coin. When the government puts in infrastructure like a water main or an irrigation system or a street or a sewer or a transit system, we're creating value around that infrastructure. That's not a taking, that's a giving. Unfortunately, there are no or few laws that deal with givings, only laws that deal with takings. And one of the things that land value return rectifies is the fact that we're very careful about takings, as we should be, but very careless about givings. And again, land value return, I think, creates a better balance there. Ibrahima, who's next?
Looks like Yanis has another question. You may go ahead, Yanis. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Yanni. Yes.
Okay. What do you think of the instead of paying for infrastructure with taxation, instead, we could be paying them by, with bonds and investments, so the people can volunteer, like what you call the community can volunteer to invest in that infrastructure, and by being an investor, they're also going to be a shareholder in the incremental value that that's going to create. What do you think of that model?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, there's a confusion, I think, when people talk about sources of funds for infrastructure. A lot of times people will mention bonds as a source of funding. And bonds are not a source of funds. Bonds are a source of financing. The difference between funding and financing is as follows. Financing is a way that some people advance money that will be paid back later. So a bond is just a fancy name for a loan. And the loan has to be paid back. So the question is, how is the loan paid back? That is the source of funds for infrastructure. Now, in terms of infrastructure, perhaps the easiest way to think about this is a toll road. A toll road produces revenue in the form of tolls. So a private entity might provide financing. It might be equity financing or debt financing to build a road. In other words, they provide a lot of money today in exchange for getting revenue that will come back over time. And hopefully that revenue that comes back over time will equal or exceed the amount of money they put in. Now, if the money they put in is equity capital, they're at risk if that money doesn't come back. If they put in debt equity or a loan, they're guaranteed to be repaid whether the revenues are sufficient or not. So the key question about your bondholders is, what is their source of repayment? And we'll get more into that in future classes. But it's an interesting question, and thank you for raising it.
Good. So it looks like we don't have any. Oh, Warren. Warren wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Warren.
Yes. Are you familiar with the book Capital Cities by Samuel Stein?
Yes, I've read it.
Okay. So a lot of what you're talking about is dealing in how government deals with private developers, and goes and shows how corrupt it is. It really brings it home, and like they really bend to the industry. So I find your comments highly accurate in regards to that. I just wanted to let you know that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think, one of the things, I don't know if you were on the class last week or not, but one of the things we talked about at the end of last week's class was the problem of honest graft. And, that was a case where George Washington Plunkett, who was a Tammany Hall politician, in fact, I'll bring up the slide if I can find it from last week. Honest graft, yes. So George Washington Plunkett said, if somebody embezzles money from the Treasury or takes bribes, well, that's wrong. That's dishonest graft. But honest graft is simply pursuing the public interest and my own interest at the same time. So George Washington Plunkett, I'm on the Public Works Board, and I see that the city plans to build a new street and water main line out into this rural area. So I, in advance, go out and buy that land at a very cheap price. And when the city is ready to begin construction, they now have to buy that land from me, and I'll charge a higher price for it. Well, that gets to, I think, the point you were making about corruption, which is that under this scenario that we've been talking about, this is the status quo, where public tax dollars create public goods and services, which funnel lots of money to very few people who own prime sites. Well, these people are going to exert undue influence about what types of public works projects happen and where they happen. There's a wonderful case in point in Washington, D.C. with our transit system. For people who haven't been following Washington, D.C.'s metro system, it's in financial difficulty right now. And a few years ago, the Federal City Council started, and the Federal City Council is an organization comprised of very wealthy landowners in the city. And they started an effort to lobby the federal government for more aid to the transit system. And people were thinking, wow, what good guys these people are, how wonderful they are, that they would be so civic-minded as to lobby the federal government to help our mass transit system. Well, maybe it wasn't so altruistic after all, because basically these people own buildings or vacant land next to our subway. And the value of their property is way up because the subway is so valuable. If the subway falls apart, the value of their property will decline. So while that may have appeared to be very altruistic and civic-minded of them, in my thinking, they were simply trying to get the federal government to pay for the transit costs that they should be paying. But they're getting a free ride because land value return is so minimal.
Yeah,
so,
like they're trying to go all the way out to Dulles Airport. I actually rode on it in January, that on the Dulles line. It's very nice, but still Dulles is very far.
Yes, for people who aren't familiar with the Washington, D.C. area, Dulles Airport was developed about 20 miles away from the downtown. And it's, at least when it was developed, it was in the middle of a rural area. It was sort of the middle of nowhere. And people thought, why build an airport way out there? Well, since it was developed in the 1960s, development has moved in that direction. A lot of highways have moved in that direction. There's been a lot of sprawl development out there. And a lot of people, and I think this is a mistake, some people think that roads cause sprawl and that transit does not. In fact, you can cause sprawl with transit. And as you pointed out, even though we have a very extensive metro rail system, people are looking to ever extend it outward. And as we extend the system outward, we're discouraging people from developing where the system already exists and land prices are high. And people are saying, well, why should I pay high land right here next to the metro stop? I'll buy land out here that's cheap. And maybe over a number of years, the metro line will be extended out to my land, and then my land will go up in value and I'll become a millionaire overnight while I sleep. So that is a problem of overextending transit. And we have to be very careful about the infrastructure we build. Under our sprawl system that we have now, we've overextended both roads and transit. And as we saw from that slide about Halifax, you know, in the early days when suburbs were new and the federal government had subsidized all this new infrastructure, it was like nirvana. All these people moved out to the suburbs, and because the infrastructure was new, the cost to operate and maintain it was very low. But now that new infrastructure isn't so new anymore. And it's becoming very expensive to maintain and rehabilitate that old infrastructure. And the federal largesse that built it isn't there anymore. And you're going to see a lot of older suburbs face bankruptcy simply because they have so much infrastructure and so few taxpayers to pay for it. Ibrahima, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do have a question from Helen.
Thanks, Ibrahima, and thanks for organizing this. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my question. As you know, I'm interested in creating brand new economic models for the globe. And so my interest is in taking land out of the buy and sell ownership model and putting it back into really what I would consider to be the commons. You know, air is part of the commons, water is part of the commons, land is part of the commons. In some traditions, spiritual traditions, it's been said that those, you know, these things that are of the commons are not really to be bought or sold.
Right.
So, and that I do feel that we're, you know, again, even with this particular so-called crisis that we're going through right now, this is a real chance to bring forward these new economic models that work for communities on a small scale and really right the injustices and inequities that have really been brought about by, you know, it's really all of us in the Western world. It's not just 1% of living off of the backs of other people and really the planet. So the model that, you know, and I won't say I'm totally familiar with, but that I was thinking about were community and land trusts. And I'm wondering how, you know, this would interface with the land trust model. How does that work? And then in practical ways, for example, how would you deal with, you know, in my case, like a municipality?
Well, I think that you raise a very good point, which is that natural resources, and land is certainly one of them, are sort of gifts to all of us, and they require stewardship. And it's important when we think about stewardship that we think about how do we preserve and enhance these resources for future generation. Unfortunately, through private resource ownership, many people manage resources for the sake of short-term profit. And that often impoverishes communities and creates lasting environmental damage that threatens the viability of the planet and our species. So it's a very critical issue that you're dealing with. And one of the things that I would suggest is that right now, our ownership model encourages this sort of waste of infrastructure. This is what we showed last week, was when we created infrastructure here, it moved development incentives to these areas. When we then extended the infrastructure to this area, it pushed development even further away. So we were despoiling the countryside, wasting resources on infrastructure duplication, which is wasteful both in terms of resources and money, and just creating terrible conditions. What some people think might be a better approach is to create a community land trust. So instead of land ownership in this area would be owned by the entire community, and decisions would be made not based on short-term profit, but in terms of long-run stewardship. And aside from the management issues involved, perhaps the biggest hurdle to move toward community land trust is the fact that initially, if we were to create a land trust in this area, we would have to buy all this land from the private owners, and that would be enormously expensive. What's interesting is that through land value return and recycling, we basically remove the profits from land speculation and return the benefits of land value creation to the community, rather than allowing it to be siphoned off by private owners. And therefore, without buying all this land, simply by reforming our taxes, we move this community in the direction of a land trust, where people are no longer speculating on how they can be parasites on community-created land value, and instead, it compels people to be more productive with the resources they control. So I think the land trust idea that you're supporting is a very important approach, and I think this tax idea is very consistent and supportive of that approach.
Very good. Looks like Yanis has another question, if I'm not wrong. Yanis, are you still here?
Yeah, well, no, I had more of a comment on the nature between public and private, because we use the term public, but it's really enacted by a set of private individuals. And I think that's creating a big issue and a big source. It's a big monkey wrench of corruption, unfair dealing. If the government really was the government, then, and it was really, caring about the, apportioning public value to each of the shareholders, that would be fine. But the way the government functions is like just any other super privileged and corporation. And you see that by how what public projects cost, and you have cost overruns, and also with social programs that they cost way too much than if it was done by community, by consensus, by non-government bureaucracies. So I think, and my understanding is that the land value capture or land value taxation does not necessarily mean that the tax will go to this bureaucratic private corporation which poses as government or calls itself a government, but it can also be returned back to the person that generated that value. That kind of echoes back my initial comment. Like, if I'm paying the rent in a certain location, I'm the one creating the value. Okay? So if my landlord has been overcharging me, I should be getting a refund, not some faceless private corporation that is corrupt and mismanages and abuses and is entrenched with all kinds of other private interests. So I think I'm not saying we should go one way or another. Personally, I like the idea of publicly created values. However, I think it's going to get more traction to make the people that pay the rent on a monthly to monthly basis that, hey, you are being overcharged, you're being price gouged, and either ask for that money back or own it or refuse to pay the high rent. And nobody should be paying a rent that's above and beyond the development and maintenance of a certain building. I'm just using a real estate context. Nobody. It doesn't matter if you're Warren Buffett or if you are like a homeless person.
Well,
Nobody should be paying rent.
You raised some very good points, and I did a report on housing economics back in the 1980s, and you're reminding me about that report that I wrote. And in terms of the rent that people pay to their landlord, as I mentioned before, to the extent that the landlord is, repairing the building and paying for the water and the electric and all those things, if you owned the building, you'd have to pay yourself for those things. So that part of the rent is reasonable. The other thing that happens, which is part of the rent, is part of that rent represents the value of the location. And that's created by public goods and services that the landlord had nothing to do with. So that's a windfall to the landowner. And then there's even yet another component of the rent. And that is the component of the rent that pays the mortgage. And the way I thought about it in the 1980s was, when you go to the bank and make a deposit in your account, you used to go to the bank in person and give money to the teller. And the teller would deposit that money in your account. Now that teller was paid a wage, and that wage came out of the interest that your money earned. But the teller didn't get an equity interest in your account. But when you pay rent to your landlord, part of that money is being used, part of the rent is being used to pay off his mortgage. And in other words, the tenants are buying equity in the building for the landowner. And that seems very unjust and unfair. So there are many aspects of rent. Some of it are justified and some not. And I don't think we can go into the whole of it here. But I do think that to the extent that we're looking at this illustration about land value, the fact that government is conferring such a huge windfall on such a small number of people indicates that these people have a big incentive to contribute money to political campaigns and then help direct infrastructure spending to help grease the windfalls that they receive. So there is in the current system a huge incentive for corruption. And that's something that we're hoping to address by eliminating this windfall to private owners who are essentially acting parasitically and not productively. Ibrahima, who's next?
Well, I don't see any hand being raised. So unless if someone has a question.
Well,
this is Marty. I wanted to have Rick comment on the situation in Vancouver where they've put in a empty home tax, whether that's something that has been used in the United States, where essentially taking the parasites who come in from all over the world to buy $100 million condos in Manhattan and just park the money and don't live there.
Right. So we've talked about how upside down the property tax is, that it punishes people for improving their property and rewards people for letting it deteriorate. And then people who have an empty building, a boarded up building, or a vacant lot pay less in tax than their more responsible neighbors, even though maintaining the infrastructure in front of each property is about the same. So the way some people have responded to this is by saying, well, instead of reforming the system the way we've just discussed tonight, how about a penalty tax on vacant lots and boarded up buildings, or as you would suggest, vacant units? And where this has been tried, it has failed. It is very well intentioned, and it appears to be moving in the same direction as what we've been talking about. but there's a reason why it doesn't work. The reason is that basically it requires a bunch of arbitrary decisions that result in nonsensical incentives. So instead of correcting the upside down incentives, we simply tack a new incentive at the end. So we say it's all right to reward you with lower taxes as long as your property declines in value. We'll reward you with lower taxes, unless you go too far. And by going too far, there's some arbitrary decision about what blight is or what vacancy is. And then we say, well, once you've gone too far, then we're going to impose this penalty tax. The problem is that people make investment and disinvestment decisions based on long time horizons. So if we leave the upside down incentives in place and then suddenly and arbitrarily say, oops, now you've gone too far, we're going to jack up your tax, that fails to have a very good impact. And I can talk about how it's worked or failed to work here in DC. In 1990, they imposed a tax on vacant and blighted property. And it was a big problem for the bureaucrats to go out and figure which properties were vacant, which were occupied. And if you think about it, properties need to be vacant at least a little bit so that people can move around, right? Somebody has to move out before I can move in. So having properties be vacant at least a little while helps people move around, and that's a good thing. So the public sector was forced to determine how long is too long for a property to be vacant. And they said, well, if it's been vacant for over a year, that's too long. So, but that's an arbitrary rule. So now the public bureaucracy has to make a list of what properties have been vacant for more than a year. As soon as they've created that list, the list is obsolete, because some properties that yesterday were vacant more than a year, all of a sudden today get occupied. And a property yesterday that was vacant for less than a year, today is now vacant more than a year. So from a record keeping standpoint, it's very problematic. From an incentive standpoint, it's very confusing. And the public sector also felt they needed to put in some exceptions. And those exceptions, while well-intentioned, had very bad results. So in the District of Columbia, they said, well, what if the property is vacant because there was a fire? In other words, these poor people had a catastrophe, a calamity. And so they're out of the building because there was a fire, and maybe they haven't had a chance to repair it yet. It would be very unfair and unjust to put a penalty on them for suffering this catastrophe. Of course, what people forgot to realize is that land speculators who may own vacant and boarded up buildings, they're speculating in the increase in value of the land. The building on the land is like anything else that's produced. It declines in value. It's a depreciating asset unless it's maintained over time. So when speculators saw that there was an exception for fire damage, the number of suspected arsons in the District of Columbia went up by 300 to 400% overnight. That was an unintended consequence of a well-intentioned law. But I think what that shows is that trying to retrofit an unjust system with a Band-Aid is going to be less effective and potentially problematic than creating a more fundamental reform. I hope that answers your question. And Ibrahima, if there aren't any new questions.
No, that was excellent. Thanks.
Go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, if there aren't any additional questions, we could end our session for this evening, but are there more questions?
Yes, I do have one question. It's a very kind of a little bit more general. I was wondering if there was or there is any experiment implementing the model that you just presented, the LVRR, and if so, how did it turn out to be?
Yes, so class number 4, if we'll go up to our program. So can people see this slide here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let's see. Whoops, wrong slide. I apologize for that. Let me see if I can do this better.
Yep.
So here's our program, and we're just on class 2. So in our next class, we're going to talk about land value return and other value capture techniques. Somebody asked about tax increment financing. People asked about development impact fees. All of that will be covered next week. In class 4, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll talk about real-world examples where land value return has been implemented. And that's, I think, what you were getting at to just now, Ibrahima.
Exactly, that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's class 4. And then in our final class, we'll talk about what are the opportunities and challenges for implementation. On the one hand, as I mentioned, land value return is almost universally practiced. And yet, unfortunately, it's practiced to such a small degree that it's almost invisible. So what are the opportunities and challenges for making it more robust and thereby making our communities more productive, affordable, and sustainable and equitable? So that's the sort of the subject matter that we'll be dealing with in the future. And if you'll permit me, I'll decline to answer that question now because we'll be covering it later.
Not a problem.
Are there any other questions from the chat or anybody else who has an issue at the present time?
I guess that's all for tonight. Well, I see somebody asking a question. Frank, yes.
Rick, this is Ed Dodson again. Just a final question. What do you think about a statute that would provide for self-assessment subject to the community having a right of first refusal to purchase the property at that price?
Well, what you're getting at are the difficulties, supposedly, of assessing property value accurately and fairly. And we will talk about that during implementation opportunities and challenges. But briefly, there are some people who say that it's very hard or impossible to value property accurately. And that's just not true. There are techniques available for valuing property accurately and for making the distinction between the amount of value associated with the value of land and the value associated with the improvement. And what you talked about in terms of self-assessment is the fact that under the present system, people will appeal their assessment. They'll say, Mr. Assessor, you assessed my property $1 million. It's only worth 500. And they'll spend a lot of money to have the assessment reduced so they can pay lower taxes. But if you were trying to buy that property, they'd say, well, my property is worth $2 million. So the landowner wants to have their cake and eat it too, or put another way, they want to be on both sides of the fence. They want it assessed very low when they have to pay taxes, and they want it appraised very high when they want to sell it. And what you raise is that one way to get around that tendency of people to have it both ways is to say, well, we'll let you put the value on your property yourself, but in exchange for doing that, if you put the value at a certain level, then you have to be willing to sell at that level. And that theoretically causes landowners or property owners to be more honest in their valuation. I think that system has promise. You may know more than I do about how it's been actually applied and what its successes and failures are. But I think at least that gives a sense to the other people who are listening about what you're talking about. Did I get that right?
Well, you did a good job, Rick, because I don't know that there's any place that actually enacted that as a public policy.
But it is a good. It is potentially a check on bad valuations, and I think it's worth exploring.
I agree.
Ibrahima, anything else before we close out for tonight?
It looks like that's what we have for tonight. That's all.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everybody for attending. And again, if you have interim questions or concerns, you can send them via email to Ibrahima or to myself. And again, this is, sorry about that. This is our program, so you can see what's coming up in future weeks. And hopefully by the end of our course, we'll have given people a good sense of how we can make our communities better and what you can do to move us in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Great, thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Rick, and good night.